economic equity in Detroit. Next up, I am pleased to introduce Wendy Jackson from the Kresge Foundation and fearless leader and chair of Detroit Future Cities Board of Directors to introduce our dynamic speakers.
Thank you, Ashley, and greetings, everyone. On behalf of the Detroit Future City Board of Directors, and as a funder of the important work of DFC, I am thrilled to be here today and honored to introduce two of our country's most and foremost scholars, our keynote speakers for this summit, Dr. Derek Hamilton and Dr. Andre Perry. Dr. Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy at the New School. He is also a member of the inaugural class of Freedom Scholars, a partnership of the Marguerite Casey Foundation and the Group Health Foundation. Dr. Hamilton has been involved in crafting policy proposals such as baby bonds and a federal job guarantee, which have garnered a great deal of media attention and served as inspirations for legislative proposals at the federal, state, and local levels. He has served as a member of the Economic Committee of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. He has testified before several Senate and House committees, including the Joint Economic Committee on the nation's potential policy responses to COVID-19, pandemic-induced health and economic crises. He was a surrogate and advisor for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and he has advised numerous other leading members of Congress, as well as various 2020 presidential candidates. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Andre Perry. Andre is a senior fellow with the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, a scholar in residence at American University, and a columnist for the Hechinger Report. Dr. Perry is the author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Cities, which is currently available wherever books are sold. A nationally known and respected commentator on race, structural inequality, and education, Dr. Perry is a regular contributor to MSNBC and has been widely published. Andre's research focuses on race and structural inequality, education, and economic inclusion. His recent scholarship at Brookings has analyzed Black majority cities, as well as the valuable assets worthy of increased investment. Prior to his work at Brookings, Dr. Perry has been a founding dean, professor, award-winning journalist, and activist in the field of education. He is a native of Pittsburgh, and he earned his PhD in education policy and leadership from the University of Maryland at College Park. So you're in for a dynamic session. And with that, let's hear from our dynamic speakers in a conversation that's going to be monitored by Anika. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. So I am so excited about this conversation. I mean, really the goal of the forum is to have a space for exchanging ideas and connections. And so I am so thrilled to have two of my favorite scholars here for this conversation, Dr. Derek Hamilton and Dr. Andre Perry. We are just so grateful to have both of you here today to weigh in on this conversation. So before we begin, I just want to let everyone know that we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking to Derek and Andre in conversation with me, and then we'll spend about the last 10 minutes of our time together opening it up for questions from the audience. So get your questions ready. You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And Shari Williams will come on screen a little later and we'll go through those questions. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Derek, let's kick it off with you. We've talked about earlier, there's a need to focus on economic equity and to work across multiple sectors to actually make the progress work. Can you share your perspective on economic equity and how it shows up in your work?
Well, first, gratitude. I'm excited and grateful to have the invitation and be here with you. Thank you to Wendy, thank you to you, and congratulations on this new report, as well as the interactive tool that makes it dynamic. So I'm going to start by saying who I am. I am a scholar who is unabashedly committed to justice. I recognize that all scholarship is rooted in norms, and I think it's worthwhile to lead with those norms. So I believe that what I should be doing with my craft is generating knowledge and information so as to promote human flourishing, so as to promote economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity, to empower people, to also point out that inequality is not rooted in deficit people, deficit behavior, but rather rooted in resources, power, and structures. So likewise, my understanding of economic equity is dismantling the hierarchical structures that inhibit people from realizing their true potential. And it's really problematic when we have a society where somebody's race, gender, or some other identity is valued in the marketplace differently, that actually generates rewards based on one's identity. And Andre, who's going to talk about this later, he's done extensive, or I suspect he will, done extensive work looking at the at appraisal market as one example. That's a problem. It's immoral. So I desire a society that's different. We know that many Black and brown families have low wealth, inadequate health care, work in precarious, and as this last pandemic demonstrated, essential jobs. We know that the biggest pre-existing condition of them all is wealth itself, and the racial wealth gap is rooted in a history that Black people have not, by both design and implementation, had access to the policies that have built capital for others. And when Blacks were able to amass capital, as in the case of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is recently in the news as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the massacre, the state has never protected that wealth. The state, in fact, has acted sometimes predatory. Prime example is Tulsa, and Tulsa was not isolated. But even beyond race, we don't have an adequate social safety net in place. What we have is, for the last 50 years, deregulation. We've had a market revolution where all our worth is supposed to be dictated by a proverbial market that's supposed to sanction bad behavior and reward good behavior. But it doesn't have an adequate notion of power and endowment by which we begin. This supply side economic frame is grounded in some notion that government vested in corporate interests is supposed to generate a market dynamism that will trickle down to all of us. But that promised trickle down has never been realized. I think in this moment, when we're facing this pandemic, we should take some lessons from the last Great Recession. What did we have? We had a stimulus, but that stimulus was related to a jobless recovery. We knew inequality grew. We had greater housing insecurity. We had evictions, we had foreclosures. And then if we look generationally, millennials were saddled with record levels of student debt while we told them to go to college and better themselves and wait out the recession. And then you know what else? We were politically vulnerable to messages from strong men that sought to divide us with a fascist appeal. So right now, incrementalism ain't gonna cut it. We need a bold policy infrastructure grounded in economic rights, grounded in, it's one thing to recognize that we need political rights to civil rights. However, we have actually realized them. It's another thing to recognize that human rights are incomplete without economic rights, that the right to vote, the right to choose, it's inadequate if you're hungry. It's inadequate if you're homeless. It's inadequate if you don't have a job. There are certain enabling goods and services that without them, people don't have agency in their lives. They don't have choice. The market dictates to them rather than them being able to partake in a market and realize their efforts. So what we need is a public sector that ensures that there's adequacy in these goods and services. We need public options that ensure that people have access to quality schooling, financial services, capital, and the free mobility in society without the threat of bodily harm or detention because your identity is linked to a marginalized group. What I'm arguing, especially when we consider this new industrial policy, this new infrastructure package, which I'm calling industrial and even trade policy, that it's grounded in humans and workers. We can do things like direct public hiring to ensure that there will be net new jobs, and not just net new jobs, but net new quality jobs that can be used to rebuild our public physical health and human infrastructure, green our economy, create a care economy for all Americans. This form of stimulus directly targeted at the American worker would provide a more efficient multiplier than the trickle-down notion of stimulating the top, and also promote more balanced growth. This is the concept that I think we need to envision. And it's not new or radical. We've had this before in our American history. It's called the New Deal. Of course, we also know lessons from that New Deal. Black people were largely excluded by design and implementation. So this iteration of an industrial policy that censors workers and people should intentionally be anti-racist and anti-sexist, intentionally be inclusive in design and implementation of all people, Black, white, everything, women, men, etc. Inequality and despair is a political choice, and we can make a different choice. We need to seize the reins of our government and make sure that it is promoting a moral economy. How we define our economy is up to us. What we emphasize as the measures of economic well-being, there's nothing natural about that. Those are political choices. And likewise, we can make different political choices so that we promote things like human capabilities, like the health of our society, like de-emphasizing identity in the marketplace. These are things we can do. So I know I'm talking a while, and I know we want to engage in a dynamic conversation. So let me just end by saying our current economic system is founded upon values of self-interested accumulation without bounds, greed, and exploitation. But our economy can and should be grounded in different values. Values of economic inclusion, civic engagement, social equity, human dignity, sustainability, and shared prosperity. We need to create a new economy that prioritizes our shared prosperity, centering workers' livelihood as both industrial and trade policy. This false dichotomy that labor policy is something else is problematic. A post-New Deal era shows that government can stimulate an economy that directly serves its people. Only this time we should ensure that by design and implementation, we have policies, and I can cite plenty of tangible policies that are explicitly anti-racist.
Thank you so much for that. That is amazing. I can't wait to dig into that further. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Andre, to talk about your perspectives on economic equity and how it shows up in your work specifically.
Yes, again, I want to send kudos to you, Anika, and the entire Detroit Future team for putting out incredible work, for inviting me, and having the audacity to challenge systems locally and nationally. I can't say enough that we need people like you and this organization to have the kind of courage to take on systems like you are doing. You know, equity for me, and Derek and I are good friends, and we share a lot of commonalities. And one of the things I've learned about equity, at the end of the day, it's about giving your family the ability to live out their life, their potential. And that's what it means, providing those conditions so that people can live out their potential. And And for me, I have a lot of roots in Detroit. My family's from Detroit. And I learned about family in Detroit. When writing my book, Know Your Price, I went to the home of where my father was born, Detroit. And I studied the overall conditions that surrounded his life and his death. And immediately I looked at his neighborhood, and he lived in areas that were redlined, where the homeowners loan corporation drew red lines, deeming his neighborhoods too hazardous for investment. He lived in areas where highway construction barreled through his neighborhood. He was displaced. Urban renewal that was never delivered. He also lived in areas where there was significant predatory lending that took place. And obviously there were restrictive covenants all around him, so he couldn't leave. He eventually left the city to go to Pittsburgh, where I was born. But that journey of learning that story led me to just study home values. And that's where, and I'll talk about this later, where I compared homes in Black neighborhoods to white neighborhoods, and we controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, because we wanted an apples to apples comparison between homes in Black neighborhoods and homes in white neighborhoods. And we really wanted to see the impact of race and the perception of race on those different things. And what we found pretty much astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are undervalued by 23% on average, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's about $156 billion in lost equity nationally. Now, what does that mean? You know, realistically, $156 billion might not, I mean, it's a big number, but what does it really mean? It would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Black people use to start their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a four-year public education. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It would have covered all of Hurricane Katrina damages, double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. This is a big number. My father was a heroin addict, and he was in and out of prison. He eventually found himself in Jackson State Penitentiary, where he was murdered in that prison. Now, it is clear for me, and it should be clear to everyone, if he lived in areas where just the home, where racism didn't put a drag on housing, he would have had better opportunities to go to college, start a business. His community would have better resources, better schools, better infrastructure. His life and my life would have been different. Just a few months ago, I met a sister that I for the first time in Detroit. You know, so for me, equity is about building family, you know, and I have an opportunity to build family in Detroit, really. But that opportunity is about making the conditions so that she and others can live out her life and her potential. And right now, the conditions are not right for that. And you know, and I just want to send a shout out, because for me, Derek's my family, Anika's my family, people like Chase Cantrell or Lauren Hood, Orlando Bailey, and the Urban Consulate family. That's my family now, right now. And so for me, equity is very plain. How can I build a world in which my family can live out their potential? So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure everybody in Detroit appreciates those shout outs, Andre, thank you. But I'm gonna stay with you a second and try to tie this back to the report. In the State of the Economic Equity report that we released, we found that Detroit has lost 11 middle-class neighborhoods in the past 10 years. And we also discovered that 54% of middle-class African Americans live outside of Detroit. Detroit is 78% African American. So I want to know, and I think we all are trying to sort of grapple with what's actually happening. Do you believe that this is directly related to valuation and other mortgage accessibility and access to capital?
Oh, absolutely. There's a driver there. If people want to purchase a home, it generally means they want to build wealth. And if communities are devalued, they're making financial decisions upon that. In addition, there's a sort of a community development problem that's happening. Typically, we should be able to develop a middle class from within. Mm-hmm. And the absence of a middle class, a growing middle class, tells me something about the overall conditions in education, in transportation, in the job market, and in other areas. And so for me, yes, people are moving because they want to gain the same value and equity as other people, and they're making those choices. But from my understanding, my time in Detroit, people don't want to leave the city. They want to stay in the city, and many people hold on. And we have got to figure out ways, one, to reward the people who stay in the city by creating the kind of policies that will enable folks who are living in the city to develop equity and wealth. And in addition, we also have to make sure that the job market and industry in many ways benefits the city. You know, I wrote in a lot about how we essentially, or the city for historically have kowtowed to the big three auto industry, you know, moving to the suburbs and then giving them tax incentives to do so. That can't continue. I mean, we can't sell the farm to other for companies to develop in other areas. That just can't continue. So for me, it's people are moving for equity reasons, but they shouldn't have to.
Right. Derek, I want to turn it over or back to you because one of the things that we also saw in this report was this growing income gap. 20 years ago, surprisingly, there was actually very little difference between African Americans and white wealth. And now the gap is double. It's almost half of between African Americans and white households. Are you seeing a trend nationally? And what do you think that this could be attributed to? You're on mute.
I can't help to start with a slight joke. Since we're family, Andre, can I borrow $5? Sorry. No, I'm joking. I really did appreciate it.
The income gap is real. Yeah.
No. So the trend is not just isolated in Detroit. And then, you know, Detroit has a history of segregation, particularly suburbs versus inner city, and that might partially explain why 20 years ago you didn't see some of the disparities that you're starting to see right now. But during the economic downturn, it is the case, we all know the adage that Blacks are the first fired and the last hired. It is commonly thought that it's because of where Blacks are situated along the skill development or skills dimension of our economy, but that's not completely accurate, because if we look across educational groups, we find that the disparity persists no matter what education we look at. And in fact, in economic downturn, those with an advanced degree, the comparison to whites suffer a greater loss in an economic downturn. So education is not the panacea. There is something about race. You know, as I was alluding to earlier, our economy, our political economy devalues Blackness, and it translates in marketplace, and it gets amplified in a recession. You know, it leads to how we should think about race. Race is not simply something, or racism is not simply an artifact of bigotry and ignorance. It's strategic. And when we have scarcity, like a recession, those that have power will utilize the assets they have And if we think about property rights and whiteness in a way that benefits them, and really quick, this last pandemic was a different type of recession. We made a moral decision to hibernate our economy to prevent the loss of life. So it was a scenario where virtually everyone was first fired, whites and blacks. We had massive unemployment. But as the economy began to open back up, as we began to relax some of the social distance rules that we had in place, the reemergence of that unemployment gap, where blacks are typically twice as likely to be unemployed as whites, reemerged. Today, the unemployment rate for whites in the nation is about 5.5% versus blacks, it's hovering 10%. It's greater than 9%.
Okay. So, Andre, did you you look like you were getting ready to comment on that. No? Okay. Because I have a question for both of you. So after what we talked about for both sides, this is a multi-sector issue, right? So what role do you think, and this is both of you, either of you could answer, what role do you think the private sector has in this?
Well, the private sector has a major role in this. One, they can actually treat their employees and workers well. Like it's what's hilarious to me, and I shouldn't be this flippant, but you're seeing all this charitable giving over the last 2 years, or the year and a half. And for me, the first thing I said was, what are they doing internally to pay workers well, to promote Black employees, to provide workers with the kind of benefits that will protect them during these difficult times? So the private sector has a huge role, but they should do a lot of internal work. When we think about what the private sector can do, we're always saying how much money they can give. Well, they can give a lot of money, relatively speaking, but if they don't change their behaviors, we are always going to be in this position. And so the more influence the private sector has on public goods, it will always be a challenge for people, for Black people with lower wealth. And so for me, the first thing the private sector can do is clean up their act. I mean, clean up their own house. And certainly they should invest. I do a lot of work on business evaluation as well. I'll just share one study we did. We scraped all the Yelp data off of businesses across the country. And what we found is that Black, Brown, and Asian businesses actually score as higher on Yelp, but they get less revenue as the neighborhoods they're in get Blacker. And there was a saying that our elders used to always recite. They would say our ice is just as cold. But when you look at the numbers, we represent about 14% of the population, but only 2% of the employer firms in the country. And that's more about investment. But what you hear is the businesses aren't as good. The management is not as good. You hear people talk. I mean, I've been in several programs where they would make Black entrepreneurs go through these financial literacy courses just to get a grant. You know, and what the data shows that we don't need education any more than anyone else when it comes to that stuff, right? And so what is missing is investment. So certainly the private sector must invest in Black businesses and Black people because there's so much wealth extraction that has taken place by that very sector.
Yeah. So I would start with the sobering reality about the nature of profit and the conflict between firms and workers and the conflict between firms and consumers. The nature of profit is such that being able to extract as much as you can from your workers without compensating them as much as you can generates profit. Being able to extract from consumers with regards to how much You charge them for products, and products that are least expensive generates profit. So that's a reality. Let's start there. That said, corporations are made up of people, and some people have values that go well beyond profit as well, and very well might generate a coalition of the willing who's willing to engage in more moral transactions and promote the well-being of their workers and consumers as well. But we shouldn't forget the nature of profit is when we think about that. Again, coalition of the willing. To think that there's going to be some structural change amongst all corporations, we're being naive. But then again, here's another point. Corporations exist as a result of a political process. There's a corporate charter that allows and permits corporations to exist, and that's political. We choose how they can exist and how they can be defined. We can regulate them. So by way of collective action and use of our public sector, we can define and impose upon them that they engage in more moral transactions if we desire. So we should keep that in mind as well. And then, I'll end with one other point, which is the reality that economics and politics are inseparable. And I try to give the example with corporations. They exist as a result of a political construction. So there's no separate natural positivist view of what corporations do. We can define it. And you know what the other element that gets into that relationship of economics and politics? Race. So the role of being able to racialize poverty, to be able to other people that are on the low end of the economic spectrum and attach to them the image of deserving and undeserving in a racialized way, creates lack of empathy in our system, allows us to create structures where we can allow for the extraction of both workers and people without government intervention, because the face of that poverty becomes Black.
And can I just add to that? Over a few months ago, there was a vote on whether or not to unionize in Bessemer at the Amazon facility there. And it's an important, it was an important piece, because we are talking a lot about wealth, we'll talk about economics, but Derek and I always go back to power. Wealth is power. And I don't think you're going to alter the motive of the private sector. They're built to extract by nature. I do think there are good people, as Derek stated, but I do think that the motivation is one that requires labor to be organized. Right. And so for me, we also just need a healthy conversation about power and how to gain it. And in this environment, we really do need labor to impose change, because it's not going to come from within the corporate sector.
Wow. Well, I think that leads me to my next question. In the report, we talk about using the data to really focus on 3 different lenses. These are to sort of track how Detroit is growing. One is equitable, where everyone does better, but there's still gaps. So everyone is growing. A just lens, where people are doing better, but gaps are beginning to see gaps close. And then a reparative lens. And I know I'm gonna, my Zoom is gonna blow up by just mentioning this, but with you two in particular, but a reparative lens where everyone is improving and we're addressing and accounting for historical inequities. How do you think we're really trying to activate this? We're trying to normalize it, put it in the conversation, have people talk about it, have policymakers talk about it. What do you think what are some of the first steps? How do we engage this?
Well, what's interesting, if you say the word reparations, there seems to be, for whatever reason, some controversy around that. When there's not, let's be clear. America believes in reparations, just not for Black people, Just, you know, right a few weeks after, as Derek stated, a few weeks after being socially distanced, the corporate sector said, we need to be made whole. We demand the federal government to make whole. Because if you don't, the economy will suffer as a result. And the federal government responded, right? Now, what does it look like for a community to be socially distanced for generations? Certainly, I take the perspective of Biden in this regard, that we do need fairness under the law and at all levels. However, even if you create, let's say, racially just policy, you still need to repair for the damage that was done. And so for me, we still need a reparative culture, if you will. Reparations, where reparations emerges. But if you theoretically, if you eliminate racism today, there's still going to be enormous wealth gaps and inequalities. And so at some point, you need to, you call it reparations, call it stimulus, call it whatever you like. But at some point, you need to insert some type of repair in order to make a just society.
Derek?
I mean, the reality is that we can't look at contemporary phenomena in an ahistoric lens. If we do, we're going to get an inaccurate depiction of what the source of the problem is. So, you know, reparations has the additive effect of changing narratives in a more truthful way. You know, the arguments that if poor people would only get an education, if poor people would only stop having kids out of wedlock, if poor people would only, it changes if we do that truth and reconciliation. It changes if we go back and understand that the contemporary phenomena we see today is rooted in a history in which government has enabled some people and preyed upon others. That changes, and it spills over and affects white people as well, because as I mentioned, we racialize poverty in America. White people suffer from that as well. So it has the added component of not only dignity, not only getting the narrative right, affecting how we think going forward, affecting how we tackle problems going forward. And then the obvious thing is the most direct and parsimonious approach to redress the harms of the past would be just to do that, to directly redress the harms of the past. But then I want to say one last thing, and two last things. One, it's fantastic that we can have a conversation about reparations. I'm not sure we could 10 years ago. It's fantastic that this is on the national purview. That's progress. That is, you know, I'm going to say the work of a lot of social movements and in particular, to saying we demand economic justice, period, and racial justice and gender justice. So we should celebrate that. We should celebrate that and point out that although it might not seem politically feasible tomorrow, 10 years ago, we might not have thought we could have been at this moment today. So we shouldn't have the myopic view of what is feasible at the here and now, but commit to justice. Commit to justice because it's the right thing to do. And that's all we need, that faith, and that, you know, very well, that moment of when it appears, we'll be ready for it.
My biggest fear is, go ahead, sorry.
One tiny little point, and that is reparations is not enough. That the reason reparations is a necessary ingredient, but why it's not enough is the nature of capital, as we have been talking. So even if we, in an accurate way, redress the past and change the narratives, there's nothing to stop capital from forming and consolidating and excluding others going forward, which is why reparations is one piece of an economic rights agenda, which still we're going to need that necessary enabling of goods that are essential for people to thrive, like the right to capital, like the right to a job, like the right to a basic income.
Absolutely. It's very exciting. Both of you were right on point. I want to get to our last question and talk about the American Rescue Plan Act. So we at Detroit Future City came up with a set of recommendations that we presented to both the city as well as the state and other partners and influencers locally. But I think we would all be interested in what your set of recommendations would be.
Well, I'll start on this one because there's one thing that's near and dear to my heart, and that's education. If there's one thing we learned over the last year and a half, how important schools are to an economy, to a functioning society. And we've also learned the severe inequalities between school districts. And so this rescue plan for me, in terms of the delivery of resources to states to supply schools, still isn't enough. There's a fundamental, the structure of how we finance education will always produce inequalities. So for me, I think we should use this moment to say, hey, schools, particularly in historically Black areas, are getting significantly less resources. Nationally, schools predominantly dominated by people of color get $23 billion less than their white counterpart, $23 billion less. And so rescue is not just about filling holes.
Right.
It is also about changing the structures that produce the inequalities in the first place. And in Detroit, you saw all these kinds of escape hatches. We tried charter schools and vouchers and all these other things. And no one's really saying, well, why do we need these things in the first place? People don't need an escape hatch. They need structural change. And likewise, I would never say, don't provide relief. Relief is needed, but it's not structural change. And so for me, it's about taking this advantage of these dollars in ways that we can change structures to not to have to do this over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's great.
As it relates to the structure thing, I think localities can demonstrate, but the ultimate game changer will be at the federal level. But localities shouldn't wait. So I agree, they shouldn't wait, and they can provide demonstrations. But from a funding standpoint and being susceptible to economic upswings and downswings, the federal government is the ultimate place where we got to advocate and get this stuff implemented in a more robust way. So, but to answer the question directly, I'll say, I'm going to start with what you shouldn't spend it on. Rainy day funds, deficit reductions. That money needs to get out the door in a direct way to people. So don't spend it on that stuff. Bribing corporations to do good. And I'm not anti-corporate, I promise you I'm not. But the public-private partnership where you try to offer almost bribes or incentives for them to come in and develop a community in a certain way, that's not the time for this right now, because people are in dire straits and we need direct intervention that ensure that they get the money. So my recommendations are, we have impending cliffs coming up. We have moratoriums on evictions, moratoriums on foreclosures, but we still have a lot of people that are in arrears with their rent or might even need some help with their mortgages. So the money needs to go directly to people in a robust way, and that will generate a more efficient and fair multiplier, because they're certainly going to use it to address their their expedient needs and conditions right away.
That is perfect. Okay, I think we're going to turn it over and open it up to the audience. We have a whole conversation happening in the chat. There's a whole other conference that's happening over there. And then we also have several questions that I can see. So we're going to welcome Chari Williams, who's going to go through the questions for us.
Hey, yes, thank you, Anika. And we have about 10 minutes left for questions and answers. So I have a few here that I've gathered, and I just want to welcome any of our guests. If questions continue to arise, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. and we'll do our best to get to all of the questions. So one question I have here from Demba is, how do we restore what went from one of America's most prosperous to most distressed cities with a focus on its Black and African Americans?
Well, what made Detroit prosperous, let's not forget, it was a federal investment in Black workers, particularly after war or during World War II, when they forced the auto industry to hire Black people in middle-class wage jobs, and then later on, 60s and 70s, labor activity essentially sustained those jobs in the auto industry. And that gave rise to home ownership, to middle class. But it started with that federal investment. Now, it was to support war machines. But we can see that federal investment going towards a jobs guarantee or in other efforts to solidify families. And Derek has stated some of those. But what really lifted families in Detroit was really about federal investment and labor organizing from World War II throughout the 70s.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. Just the only thing I'd say is collective efficacy and political action to get public sector investments. But ultimately, there's going to be a need for direct public sector investment as it relates to industry and all types of other goods that people need, like investment in a care economy, greening Detroit, making sure that it is. I believe I saw a report. I hope I'm not misquoting something where. With regards to energy consumption, Detroit consumes a little less, but pays the highest prices for energy consumption. So that needs to change, obviously.
Awesome, thank you. So another question, I'm actually combining one from Stephanie and one from Andrew. What impacts does appraising a home have, and how do you propose we address home ownership in Detroit? I know Detroiters want low tax rates, but undervaluing the home can cause devastation for those who made investments before initiatives were implemented.
Yeah, I brought some of this up in the beginning. Since we released that report almost 3 years ago, there's been a racial reckoning in the real estate industry, in particular around appraisals and appraisers. Now, one thing I don't like about the coverage on appraisers is that the media is sort of pitching this as an individual act of racism, which it is, no question, on the part of the appraiser. But my research shows a systemic devaluation based upon the race of the community. And so there's community wealth that's extracted because of appraisal practices, real estate agent behavior, lending practices. And so it's not just an individual acts of bad appraisers in what's phenomenal about these stories. In most of these cases, they have a white stand-in, and then they get a second appraisal, and it goes up hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you really do see the intrinsic value of whiteness in that test, if you will. So clearly, we do need accountability, because this is theft at the highest level. I mean, you're talking that 100-something thousand. That's the ability to buy another home, to pass on that wealth to families, to go to college, to start a business. I mean, this is theft at a high level. And so it has a tremendous impact. And just like these individuals can test to see if they're getting a bad appraiser, so should the federal government, so should HUD. If individuals should not have to get white saviors, they should get good policy in this regard. So for me, it's about learning from these examples, learning from the research, and then adapting it to policy.
I mean, one practical solution to address the discrimination as it relates to appraising in addition to send in auditors, which is a direct thing, send in actors and see if there's systematic discrimination. But another thing, we can look to lessons of HMDA, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, in which the federal government required banks to solicit race information, and the data alone in addressing some of the discrimination that took place in banking. I don't know why we don't collect race information when we look at appraised. That's another practical. Who actually is getting the home appraised?
You know, and I'll just add one thing. During the 60s, 70s, right around the time of the Fair Housing Act, particularly in California, there was a battle, and Ronald Reagan was a part of this. Remember, there was a battle cry to have the right to discriminate, that people fought for a right to discriminate. And part of that evolved to having sectors of the housing market police themselves instead of being regulated on the part of federal agencies. And so that's partially what happened with appraisers, is that they are governed by a body, the Appraisal Institute, largely, that sets the standards. And so we need to move away from this self-governing type system that, because 90% of requests for another appraisal are denied, 90%. In addition, between 85 and 90% of appraisers, depending on if you use the industry sample, it's 85 versus if you use Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, it's 90% of appraisers are white. 90%. Let's go to low, 85% white. You know, clearly all valuation is socially constructed. But when you have a 90-some% white body valuing you, oh, you're going to see racial bias creep in.
Thank you. So Michael asked the question, I work with a nonprofit in Detroit that seeks to overcome economic inequality by establishing networks of cooperative, worker-owned businesses in Metro Detroit neighborhoods to increase individual agency at work and build community wealth. I would like to hear either both speakers address whether they see such new models of business ownership as important in creating economic equity and comparable opportunities for communities of color.
So before you begin, I want to limit your answers to just 2 minutes because we only have about 6 minutes left and about 20 questions.
I mean, I'll be quicker than that. I like it a lot. I like collective efficacy. As individuals, we will not overcome, but strategies around linked fate, both in terms of economic cooperative and even more essential, political cooperation in a way to demand from your government that it acts in moral ways, is the pathway forward to economic mobility and inclusion.
And I can't add any more to that.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so we have Medvis says, can working class Detroiters be expected to excel socially and economically if our public buses do not operate in a reliable fashion, our public schools are not showing an improvement in reading and math test scores, the bulk of our public library branches remain closed, violence increases, and housing rent prices continues to rise. Working class Detroiters tend not to be able to buy their way out of a broken public infrastructure.
I mean, I'll go first and just say, I think the question is spot on. For the last 50 years, we've had an emphasis on individuals and individual deficit behavior as the explanation for inequality in almost every domain that we look at. So the sentiment of this question is that we need public works. We need public works to enable people, to empower people. And something as simple as a running bus is a necessary ingredient.
And the only thing I'll add is Black people are tax-paying folk. we should demand that we get the return on our investment, and we're just not getting a return on our investment.
That is the truth.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here from Davida. Dr. Perry, according to your study, Black people represent 12.7% of the US population, but only 4.3% of the nation's 22.2 million business owners. Is redlining and discrimination by banks the only disadvantages Black business owners face? What can we be doing better in supporting Black owned businesses?
But remember, I always have to bring this up. Most businesses are started by using the equity in people's homes. And so if you don't have individual wealth, it's going to be hard to open up businesses. I mean, only 7% of white businesses start with a loan, are founded with a loan, and only 1% of Black businesses are founded with a loan. So they're started with the equity that they have, or the savings they pull from a 401k or something like that. And so, you know, the start for me has always been, we have got to figure out ways to increase individual families' wealth and to enable them to start a business.
Shari, one more question for Dr. Hamilton, and then we have to transition.
All right, yes. So we have, if investment is the key, why not seek to use the money the city is getting from the American Recovery Act to establish a fund to invest in small to medium Detroit businesses? These funds could also be used to leverage private investment funds as well. Right now, Duggan's plan commits to $26 million to small businesses, far too little.
Oh no, did we lose? I think we may have lost Derek. I think maybe his internet might be a little unstable. Andre, would you like to take that question before we?
But it broke up for me too. But here's.
Oh, there we go.
So I think I heard the question, but I probably didn't. My internet. One thing we need is public broadband. Clearly, here's an example. Actually, I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
No, that's quite okay. The question was really, it was another touch on the American Recovery Act. And it says, if investment is key, why not seek to use money the city is getting from the American Recovery Act to establish a fund to invest in small to medium Detroit businesses?
That would not necessarily be an inappropriate use. I mean, if those businesses are targeted in a way that are given access to other people who don't traditionally have access, and that they're in industries that can lead to public works in some way that can have some spillover benefits. But, you know, in earnest, if it was me, I would do direct public hiring so that the product that's being produced is maintained within the city in perpetuity as an asset.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Okay, so I think we're going to have to close it out. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, and I'm really, really sorry about that. We're going to try to capture the questions that we didn't get to and try to get back to people as much as possible. I want to thank Dr. Andre Perry, Dr. Derek Hamilton. You all have been phenomenal. This is just, I'm overwhelmed at this conversation. You have given us so much to think about and so much, and this was a call to action in and of itself.